Coming up on this tutorial, we discuss the menu screen, to where we can, select a menu entry with the mouse or with the keyboard, and then select an actual entry and perform actions based on that. So I hope you enjoy this tutorial. Hey, Nathan here, and welcome to another tower defense tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to discuss the main menu screen. So last tutorial, we did the level selection screen, and that was over a 50-minute tutorial because I wanted to discuss in great detail how it's working and what we needed to do to make a good-looking level selection screen. Now, we've made menu systems in the past, so I will go quickly on this. I'll just discuss the new way that the menu screen works, and then there are a few things here and there that I will discuss, but I'm going to do things relatively quickly. Since we've done menu systems in paddles and tower defense or space shooter, we've just extended the functionality of the menu system. Okay, so at the very top of the menu screen class, the main menu screen.cs, we need to add a few more using statements to make sure everything's working. So you want to add the following using statements: Microsoft.xna.framework.input, Microsoft.xna.framework.content, Microsoft.xna.framework.graphics, and Tower Defense Engine. Once those are added, we can go to the actual class itself, and as you see here, we have a bunch of overrides for string properties. Now, this is the way that the new menu system works. This is the version 3 of the menu system. With paddles, it was version 1. With space shooter, it was version 2. Now, this is version 3. We need to provide action names for the menu system to work properly. The menu system does most of its thing on its own, so it is referring to the menu cancel action name, next entry action name, previous entry action name, and selected entry action name. So the menu system is the one that's going to be interpreting your input through these action names. Now, depending on your screen, your menu implementation, these can be very different, and you can call these whatever you want. So I'm going to make a whole bunch of string objects for the previous entry, next entry, selected entry, and cancel menu. And just inside of each of these properties, you see throw new not implemented exception. Delete the throw new implemented exception. And then put in place of that, put in return and the string object that refers to the action. So in this case, I am working on the menu cancel action name. I want that to return the cancel menu string. And then do the same thing for the others. Okay. Now, why are we doing it this way instead of saying return quote select entry? So why are we doing return a string object versus return a value in quotes? Well, this is going to be called 60 times a second. The menu system checks the input map. If a new action has been pressed with this action name, it's going to check that 60 times a second. Now this creates a string object every time it's called. So if you do it this way, you're creating a string object 60 times a second. Now, sometimes that can be appropriate, like if it's a timer, that value will always change, but the select entry will never change. So we just create a string object and then return that object. So it's only creating one, and then it just returns that one 60 times a second. Okay, so those are the action names. Now we need to worry about the entries. And you saw this at the very beginning of the video. The available options for the menu systems are play, options, help, and quit. So we need to make those actual main menu entry. Play, options, help, quit. Okay, now after that we need to have a constructor, public main menu screen, and in here we are going to set our action names, the string values here, the transition time, and the colors for our text. So the action names, I'm going to choose the menu system you saw at the very beginning of the video. The entries go from the top to the bottom. It's a vertical system. You can create a horizontal system if you want. You can create a diagonal one if you want. But for the way I did it, it is a vertical. We have play, below that options, below that help, below that quit. So I'm going to use up and down arrow keys. So I'm going to call the action name up and down. And then the select and cancel will be menu accept and menu cancel. So previous entry I'm going to set as menu up. Next entry will be menu down. Selected entry will be menu accept. Cancel menu will be menu cancel. Okay, so when you have a screen system, you will sometimes want a screen to fade in, fade out, you know, whatever you want it to do. Have animation transition between two screens. You know how if you've done PowerPoint, you have transitions between slides, or if you do video editing, you can have transitions between clips, images, whatever. So we can have a transition between screens, and that transition will work based on the transition time from the system itself. So the transition on time, we want it to be slower coming on. So transition on time is equal to time span dot from seconds. So we want it from 1 second. So it's going to take 1 second for the screen system to transition on. And then depending on how you want it to animate, you can do that in the transition, that call that will be made as it's entering or exiting. Now transition off time, we want that to be a little bit slower, or I'm sorry, a little bit faster. Time span from seconds 0.5. So it's going to be half a second to transition off versus 1 second to transition on. Okay. A menu system has various colors depending on the state of the entry. When you first bring up the menu system, you see that play is a different color. That's to identify that you have highlighted that entry. All the other entries are a different color. That's to identify that those are not selected / highlighted. So what we need to do is separate those colors. We have a selected, highlighted, and normal color values that the menu system refers to. So we want selected and highlighted to be the same color. So I'm going to say selected is equal to highlighted is equal to new color. And then let's go ahead and add, using Microsoft.xna.framework at the top. And then the RGB values is what you'll pass into this constructor. And you can get these various ways. What I did to get these is I designed what I wanted the menu system and the game. I designed that in Photoshop. And then I produced all the graphics, wrote down all the text colors that I made, and just wrote down the RGB values of them. So selected is equal to highlighted is equal to new color. Let's pass in the RGB values of 214, 232, 223. And again, I got these values from Photoshop. I just wrote some text down, played with the RGB values of the text color, mess with the curves adjustment, and anything else that produced that RGB value, and I wrote that down, and I can put it into the code. Alright, normal will be a different color, so normal is equal to new color with the RGB values of 104, 173, 178. Okay, now let's go ahead and worry about the initialized screen. Now, in that case, we need to add the entries to the actual menu entries list that we have in the menu system itself. So, yeah, we created menu entries here, but there's no way for the menu screen to reference that because it's not in the menu screen's main menu entry list. So we need to add those entries to the list. We need to add actions for the input map. We need to actually set up our entries. So we provide the entry with the title and description. And then we set up our events. An entry is selected, or the menu system itself. Is the menu system in an entering state, exiting state, or is it a removing state? So all these things need to be taken care of. And now, we add our action names to the input map, and you provide the keys or mouse presses you want to associate with those actions. So for my vertical menu system, the previous entry will be when I press the up arrow key. The next entry is when I press the down arrow key. To select a menu entry, you can either press enter on the keyboard or click your left mouse button. To cancel the menu system, I just set it up to be the escape key. Okay, so now we have all these menu entries here: play, options, help, and quit. We need to actually set up we actually need to call the constructor for those and set up new objects. So the menu entry accepts a menu screen that is where it belongs to, so we just pass in this. The second value we need to pass in is the title of the entry. So play, options, help, and quit. The last one we pass in is the description, what you want to appear at the bottom. Okay, so now we have our removing and selected entering and exiting events. Now these will occur depending on the current state of the either entry or the system itself. So when we actually press enter when we're on play, when we press enter, it throws an event to the play select method, which we have not made yet, so all these are in red underlines. And like I said, we need to actually add these entries to the menu entries list. And that is in the menu screen. So the menu screen has to be aware of these entries, and it does that through a list. Okay, so now a very good enhancement to the menu system from the space shooter to this is the ability to have a description of the entry, and you pass those in when you call the menu entry constructor. That is the last value you pass in. So those are the descriptions. We need a way to actually visually represent the descriptions, and in order to do that, we need to set the description area. So let's get a viewport, a view object, and that needs to be from the screen system.viewport object. So we need to just get that so we can get the width and the height of the game screen. And then the menu system itself has a set description area that you can call. That's built into the menu system menu screen class. And then you can call that because you are a derivative of that class. So we just call that method, and the first thing it wants is a rectangle where we want to position the description area. You might want to have it at the top right, top left, bottom right, center of the screen. I chose to have it at the bottom of the screen, minus 100 pixels from the left. So it's pushed to the bottom right. It extends all the way except for 100 pixels from the left edge of the screen. So you need to provide a new rectangle. I'm going to push the left edge of the rectangle 100 pixels from the left edge of the game screen. I'm going to push the top part of the rectangle from the very bottom of the screen minus 100 pixels from the bottom of the screen. So I get the view.height, that gives me the vertical height of the game screen window minus 100 pixels. Now we need to pass the width of the description area. We want it to fill the entire width minus the 100 we passed in to push it 100 pixels from the left. So it's going to be view.width minus 100. Now the height, you can just set it a static value. I chose 50. That way it's not at the very bottom of the game window. It's a few pixels pushed up with that 50 versus 100 here. Okay, so that is the position. Now, we need to pass in a few colors. Now, the box color is what we want the main description box to look like. The text color is what we want the text to look like. And then how much we want to scale the font. So again, I did all this with Photoshop. So I got the RGB values. So for the box color, you want the RGB values of 11, 38, and 40. For the text color, you want the RGB values to be 29, 108, 117. Now, I'm going to pass in a point value here after the colors, and that refers to a padding. I want to give it 10 pixel padding on the left and the right, but 0 pixel padding on the top and the bottom. And then I want it to be displayed at 0.5 float for the scale. It's half the scale of the normal text. Okay. Last thing we need to do for the initialized screen is we need to start playing the song. So we call audio manager dot singleton dot play song. Open parentheses, quote, we call the cue menu. So it starts playing the menu song, and I'm going to comment this out because I do not want it to play while I'm doing the video. So you'll just add that line and it will automatically play the menu system song name. And you should have got that in the very first tutorial. There was a package that I gave you, and I only gave it to you on the first tutorial because it's about 40 to 50 megabytes with all the music and sound effects I did. And I do not want to have you download a 40 or 50 megabyte file, every single tutorial. So I only gave it to you on tutorial 1. I removed it from my code here. As you see, if I open up the audio, it's not available because when I zip these up, I don't want to give you these again and create a 50 megabyte file. This is just for the code, and then you can get the assets from tutorial 1 and then add it to the code if you want to. So if you did do it that way, if you just downloaded this sample, you'll need to go to tutorial 1 and download the assets before you can play the song. Alright, load content. We're going to load all of our textures, all of our sprite fonts, and we need to initialize a few things there. So just like any screen from a screen system, we can get the content manager from the screensystem.content. And from there, we can load content by using that content manager object. So the menu system has a sprite font built into it. It's in the menu system, menu screen level. So we just call content.load the sprite font we want it to have, and then we pass in the location of that font. The entry texture, we want the entry texture to be, if you look at the completed version, behind the text, play, options, help, and quit, we have a little box. Now that is referring to the entry texture. So we need to load a texture 2D object and call that texture and load it into the texture 2D object. Now the menu screen has a background texture. That is the overall background. You saw at the very beginning of the video that bluish background at the very back end. It was below the logo, below the menu entries, and below the title descriptions. That is just the background texture of the entire screen. We load that into another texture 2D object. The title texture is the logo at the very top center. That's where I positioned it. You can position it anywhere you want, and we will initialize the title position in a few lines here. But we need to load the actual texture into the title texture 2D object. We do want to enable the mouse, and we do need to pass in what we want the mouse to look like, and that's using another texture. So we just load in a texture 2D, and we call enable mouse with that texture. Okay, so the title position is going to be, the initial title position is going to be the same as the base title position. And that's going to be a new vector 2 with the width minus the texture width divided by 2. So that puts it at the center, horizontal center of the screen. And we want to push it 50 pixels from the top. Okay, so now initialize is called before load content. So if you want to use relative position with the line spacing like below, you need to do that after load content and sprite font. So we want to do relative positioning with the sprite font by using the line spacing here. And we do that after we load it in. Load content is called after initialize. So this is called first, then load content. So we need to do some more stuff here based on the content that was loaded. And that is a sprite font. We loaded that in. And now we want to use relative positioning for that. Okay, so now the menu system menu entry portion accepts a add texture method. Now this method is so you can add a background texture that is under the text to be displayed. That accepts a texture 2D object, the number of textures. It's referring to a sprite sheet here. So you can have a number of textures in X and a number of textures in Y. You can have a sprite sheet and pass it in here. So in this case, the sample I gave you, the texture I gave you, has only two different textures in a horizontal position. So we pass in two number of textures in horizontal, one in vertical. So we pass in 2 for the number of textures in X, 1 in the number of textures in Y. Then it accepts a rectangle for the selected and normal. How you want it, which texture you want to use when you select the entry, which one you want to use when it's a normal, non-selected entry. In this case, I want to choose the first texture if it's selected, the second texture if it is not selected. So the new rectangle, 0, 0, entry.texture.width divided by 2, entry.texture.height. So that's referring to the first texture. We pass in the rectangle. It's going from the 0, 0, which is the top left. The width is the overall texture width divided by 2, so it goes to the center of the entry, and the full height. So it goes from the top left to the very bottom and centered horizontally. So it gets to that point here. So that is that rectangle we will use for the selected entry. For the non-selected normal entry, we're going to use the other texture, which is from the very top and the center of the texture. That's where it begins and then ends at the bottom right of the overall texture. But when we have a rectangle, we pass in width, not ending position, but the width. So what we need to do is do the same thing. It starts at entry texture.width divided by 2, and the width is going to be entry texture.width divided by 2. Now for the Y, it starts pretty much the same as the other rectangle. It starts at 0, and that's the full height. And then we want to add padding horizontally and not vertically. Okay, so if this is the very first entry, we need to set the position, the actual position. It's not going to be a relative position because we don't have anything to reference. We need to set the actual position directly for the very first entry. And that's going to be 180 pixels from the left, 250 pixels from the top. And we pass in if it is a default position or not. So we say yes it is, so we pass in true. If it is not the first entry, we need to calculate the offset. The offset is a value based on the previous entry, I-1, and that's texture. So we check to see if that texture is equal to null. If it is, we just use the line spacing. If it is not null, you can give it a value like 8, or if you want more spacing, you can increase that value. If you want less spacing, you can decrease that value. Alright, once we got the offset in the Y, we need to do call .set relative position of that menu entry. We pass in the relative vector 2. We do not want to push it anywhere horizontally. We do want to offset it in the Y. So just this vector 2 is a relative position. Then we need to pass in the menu entry object that the position is based on. And then, of course, this is the default position. Okay. Once we got that done, that is the load content. Now let's go ahead and do a public override unload content. And we're just going to unload the sprite font is equal to null. Okay, so now a few events here, and I'm just going to copy and paste all the events that we created And I'm going to paste them in, and I will explain what's going on, just so I can go ahead and end this tutorial. We've done this before with the space shooter and a few of the samples, but I'll just discuss these in a little detail here. So the entries events and the screen events that we made up here, we need to make all those methods that it's referring to inside the parentheses. So let's start with the main menu removing. And I don't have an option screen yet, so I'll go ahead and comment that out. So main menu system removing. We just clear out the menu entries list. That's all we need to do for this. Now, how about when it's entering and exiting? We want it to transition on and off. So when we have an entering and exiting, what we want it to do is the way I wanted it to do is I wanted it to slide in when it's entering. I wanted the entries to slide in from the left, the title of the menu system to slide in from the top. You can have it fade in with the opacity value change, which I do here. Or you can have it zoom in if you want to. There's all sorts of things you can do. But for the effect of sliding in from the left to the right for the entries, and the sliding in from the top to the bottom of the title, we need to do that based on the positioning of the actual entry and the title. And I also threw in a fade effect with the opacities for each. Okay, so when you create an event with entering or exiting in the menu system, you get a TEA object that's referring to the transition event arguments. That's going to give you the percentage of completion, TEA.percent. That's going to give you the percentage of completion. I'm going to subtract 1 from that value. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 1 from the percent. Then I'm going to square the result. So it gives it a nice curve effect, a slow transition. It speeds up in the middle of the transition, but it slows down. So it's going based on a curve. If you're into math, think of the x squared curve. So I'm going to square it so it gives it a nice feel to the effect. Then I'm going to multiply it by the maximum I want to accomplish. So the maximum value is going to be -100. That's going to be 100 pixels difference from the positioning. So as you see at the very beginning when we created the entries, the position was 180. I want to push that as a maximum 100 pixels to the left. So it's going to subtract 100 from the 180, and that will be the maximum. So at 0.0% completion, it's going to be at 80 pixels instead of 180 pixels. So what I do here is I do a for each loop for every entry in the menu entries list. I set the entry's acceleration to the effect in the X. I only want to slide in horizontally. So only provide the effect in the X and 0 in the Y. I do not want it to offset in the Y. Then I provide a position change, and that's going to be the default position plus the acceleration. Then the opacity is going to be the percentage of completion, which we get from TEA.percent. Now for the initial title position, I want that to offset the title on the Y axis and no offset in the x-axis. So I do the same thing except for have effect in the y-axis and 0 in the x-axis. Now exiting, I just do the same thing except I provide positive 100 here except negative 100 here. And then I scale it down as well. Okay, so that was the fading in and fading out based on the entering and exiting event. Now all the events for the entries is going to be very similar. For play, we want to completely exit the screen because we are now playing the game. And we add a play screen or the level selection screen. If you want it to jump, if you only have one map, you want it to jump into that map right away, you just load in the play screen, uncomment this line out, comment this line out, and then just load the play screen. If you have multiple maps, you can load the level selection screen. When we click options, we want to freeze the screen because we will go back to it. Then we want to add the options screen, which has not been implemented yet, so I commented that line out. When you click help, it will freeze the screen because we will go back to it, and it will add the help screen. When we quit, we want the entire game to exit. Alright, so that's it for the code. Now let's go back to the TowerDefenseGame.cs file and let's load in the screen. So in the initialize method of the TowerDefenseGame.cs class, the very first thing that is not a comment is we say screenSystem.addScreen, new help screen, new video intro screen. Delete the new help screen, parentheses, new video intro screen, and let's provide a new main menu screen, opening and closing parentheses. So that line should be called screenSystem.addScreen, parentheses, new main menu screen, parentheses, two ending parentheses, and a semicolon. Now we press F5, build it, run it, see how it looks. And the text is a little bit small. But as you see, if I press quit here, it'll completely quit the game. And if I do help, it'll bring up the help menu. Now if I press escape, escape again, it will fade out. As you saw that fade effect. Now it does fade in, which I cannot display here. Let me go ahead and move this just 1 second. Okay, so I removed the recording window to my second monitor, and I'm just going to press F5 on the code we just completed, and then you should see the Tower Defense game come up on the recording window, and you should see the fade effect. So you saw it slide in and then stop. And then if I press escape here, okay, so that was it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and I apologize for another lengthy tutorial. The text in the menu was a bit small for me. You might prefer it that way, but you can go into the sprite font. You know, we load in the menu entry, we call it a menu.sprite font. So if you go into your content and go to your fonts and then the menu, you can increase the size of that. You can make it, you know, bold instead of regular, whatever you want it to do, so it looks nice to you. Change the font if you want to. So I'm going to leave it alone for now. You can mess with that to fit your needs. Okay, next tutorial, we are going to discuss the options screen. So I hope to see you next time.